Okay everyone, so let's start adding details. First, let's go and let's see what will happen when I try to convert our hinges layer into a normal map. So let's make a selection. Now let's click convert. Okay, so now as you can see, the result doesn't look too convincing. The hinges are basically composed of a single element, and that's not what we want. We want those cylindrical elements to look kind of like tubes. And we also want them to be made up of multiple elements, maybe let's say out of 3. Okay, so in order to achieve this, we're going to use height maps. Now it's possible to get those kind of shapes using selections, but it requires you to use a lot of masking and a lot of layers, so that becomes quite difficult to manage. The quickest way, in my opinion, is to create a simple height map, so let's go and let's make one now. Okay, so the first thing I'm gonna do is I'll go up and disable this layer, which will essentially remove this purple overlay, which is used by the nDo to create our normal map. Okay, now I'll also go and disable our new normal map layer. And now as you can see our hinges layer in grayscale. Now let's select the magic wand tool, and let's select this cylindrical bit in the middle. Okay, now let's create a new layer. And let's fill this one with any kind of color. Black should be fine. Okay, now let's go and let's remove our hinges layer because we don't need it anymore. Okay. Right, so what we have to do now is we have to create a height map which will essentially define the shape of a cylinder. So what I'm going to do is I'll right click on this layer and go to blending options, and I'll go and choose the gradient overlay. Now in order to make it look cylindrical, we have to edit a few of its options. So let's select this menu and let's change the angle to 0. Okay, now let's also go and let's change the style to reflected. Okay, and I'll also go and select the reverse option. Okay, so we've got this basic gradient that looks kind of cylindrical, but in nDo we will have to create a black background for this layer in order to convert it into a normal map. And when we do that, this gradient will essentially blend with the background, so we have to modify a little bit. So let's click on the gradient, and now let's go and let's click here to change the color to something maybe gray. Okay, now let's close all of this. Okay, and now let's create a new layer below this one, and let's fill it with a black color. Okay, so what we're gonna do next is we'll have to make it look like this cylindrical element is split into 3 parts. So I'll go and enable this layer to act as a guide. Now I'll zoom in, center on this part, and create a new layer. Now let's select the pencil tool by right-clicking and then choosing the pencil tool. And now I'll simply paint 2 lines here and here with a black color. I'll just do it very roughly. Okay, now let's disable this layer. And yeah, we've got the shape split into 3. Now let's change the opacity of this layer to 50%, and this way it will look like the cuts actually follow the shape of the cylinder. Okay, now let's go and let's merge those 2 layers together, and let's unhide this one. Okay, we'll position this one on top of it, so we can see it better. Okay, so now we're simply going to duplicate this layer. So we're going to press Ctrl J, and now I'll simply select the Move tool and move it down like this, and position it in front of the other one. And it will snap right in. Next, I'll do the same with the other one, by quickly clicking and dragging, and then I'll use the arrow keys to position it precisely in place. Now let's do the same with the final one. Again, I'll use the arrow keys. Okay, and now let's merge those 4 layers together. Alright, and let's move it down below. Right, now let's merge this layer with the black layer. Okay, and now we can pretty much zoom out, then hide this layer and generate our normal map. Okay, now as you can see, we've got some cylindrical shapes in there. So let's enable this layer so we can actually see our normal map. And now let's go and zoom in. And now we can see that our shapes don't really look the way we intended, so we have to modify a few options in nDo. Okay, so I'll go and increase the depth to maximum first. Now let's also drop the size down to 1. to increase the sharpness of those lines between the elements. And let's also go and let's change the bevel to emboss. This will essentially make the whole shape bigger, and it will make it look more like what we wanted. Right, now the final thing I'm going to tweak is I'll change the curve to half round. And now our shape looks nice and smooth. So let's enable the previewer. And yeah, it looks nice and round and looks just like the way we intended. Okay, so now let's go and let's add the square parts of our hinges. So let's close this, and let's go and let's enable this layer. And let's move it below the previous normal map group. Okay, now let's preview the result. Let's click the refresh button to refresh the window. Okay. So yeah, thanks to combining the height maps and selections, we've made our hinges very, very quickly without having to use too many layers. Right, so now that we are done with it, let's close this window. And let's rename those two layers to something appropriate. So I'll call this one hinges square elements. Okay, and I'll call the next one hinges cylindrical elements. Alright, so now that we are done with hinges, let's go ahead and let's add some further details. So what I'm gonna do is I'll go and add maybe some kind of trims to those metal panels on the top. So I'll add one here and maybe another one here. Right, so what we have to do is we'll have to make another selection. So let's go and let's select the single column marquee tool. Now let's click Ctrl' to enable the grids, and let's add one in the middle, then maybe one here, and one here. Basically we're going to use those darker gray lines of the grid. Right, now let's go and let's click Convert, and when I go and disable the grids, you'll see that we can't really see our lines very well. When I zoom in, you will see that all we have is this very thin 1 pixel wide line. But we can change that very easily with nDo. Right, so what we have to do is we have to change the bevel to emboss, and now our lines will become much thicker. Right, but let's change the slant to down, so it actually looks like the lines are pointing inside the surface. Okay, and let's change the depth to maybe the maximum. Okay. Right, but now we have this problem where the lines go through the whole door, and we don't really want that. So what we're going to do is we'll have to hide those unwanted parts, and we're going to do that by using our metal panels layer that we left out before. So the way to do that is quite simple. We'll simply have to toggle the previewer off. Now I'll go and find our metal panels layer. I'll right click on it, and I'll use select pixels to create a selection. Then I'll go to this top layer group, and I'll click this button here to make a mask. Right, so now as you can see, we've gotten rid of those unwanted lines. So we can use masking to create all kinds of cool effects, and it works perfectly with nDo. Right, so now that we've got this part down, let's go and let's rename this layer. Maybe let's call it Metal Panels Indents. Okay, so now maybe let's add some screws and maybe some rivets and so on. So the process of adding screws is actually quite simple. All we have to do is we have to go and paint some circular shapes in some areas and then convert it into a normal map using nDo. So let's go ahead and let's do it. So I'll create a new layer. Now I'll go and select the brush tool. And now we have to make sure that we have some kind of a round brush with a hard alpha selected. You can use one of the stock Photoshop brushes. Right, so now let's press the left bracket key a couple of times to reduce the size of this brush. Something like this should be fine. And now I'll simply go and create a round shape somewhere here. Okay. Okay, so now we're gonna duplicate this layer, and the reason why I prefer to duplicate it is because I can use the move tool, and when I press the shift button, I will be able to move everything on the one axis, so it's a lot easier to position things precisely. Right, now let's merge those two layers, and let's press Ctrl-J again to duplicate it, and I'll simply hold shift and move it down, and then adjust it slightly with the arrow keys. Right, now let's merge those layers, let's press Ctrl-J, and let's move them to the side. Alright, and then adjust it slightly with the arrow keys. Okay, now let's merge them, And when it comes to duplicating multiple shapes, that's generally the technique I use. Okay, so now I'm gonna skip ahead and I'll go and add some more screws to our door. Okay, so now as you can see I have finished adding the details, so let's zoom in. And as you can see I've added a bunch of screws all over the place. What I did is essentially I just created a couple of layers and I just duplicated them over and over again until I got the result I wanted. Basically I tried to add the screws in places where they would make sense to be. So I tried to connect multiple elements such as hinges and those metal bars and make it look like the door was actually constructed by a living person. Alright, now before we convert it into a normal map, I will show you one quick technique that you can use to add repeating details. So what we're going to do is we'll add a row of rivets along those indents, and we're going to add them on two sides. So let's create a new layer, and then let's click here to open up the brush panel. Now here we have to adjust the spacing option, and I will simply increase the slider. And as I do that, you will see that the space between each circle increases. Right, so now let's close this, and I'll simply press Shift, and I'll simply drag my brush down like this. And as you can see, we've got a bunch of rivets just in one stroke. Right, now I'll simply go and duplicate this layer and move it to the side while holding Shift. Now I'll merge them again and duplicate them again and simply move them once again to the side, and I'll do that once more. Now let's merge all of those layers together along with the rivets I made before. And now I'll go and click select pixels and hit convert. Okay, so now we've got all of our screws and rivets converted into a normal. And as you can see, they actually look quite good. So I'm gonna leave them like this without adjusting any of the options in nDo. Now let's go and let's rename those layers. So I'll call this one screws and rivets. And I'll go and call this one the same name. I'm going to keep this layer because later on we might need it for our diffuse texture. Okay, so at this point we're done with adding those kind of details. What we're gonna do next is we'll focus on adding damage and maybe some kind of dents to our normal map. But before we do that, I'll show you a quick tip on how we can improve the performance of nDo and how we can manage your PSD files to make working with normal maps easier.